Mary, you want to go next?
Sure. So yeah, my expectations are to review the data together and see what sort of, I would say, like how we can design for what the needs are, what's really going on in the mesh, and prioritize our work based on real user stories. So I see a lot there.
Love it. Thank you. Claudia?
Hi, everybody. I'm just really excited to see what the feedback is. It's almost, for me personally, I haven't had enough not exposure, but to be able to see what the mesh is thinking and this amount of people.
Mm-hmm.
It's really exciting to see what's out there, you know. So yeah, I'm excited to do this and learn and with all of you.
Great, thanks. Sorry, I just apparently the sharing access is not on. Let me just fix that. Sorry about that.
Yeah, I'm in.
Oh, yeah? Okay, cool.
No problem. And also even got to the interview questions.
Okay, great.
Yeah. What about you? Well, no? Still no?
I'm in now, yeah.
Okay, sorry, thanks.
And then this is the interview questions. Yeah. The only thing I couldn't get into was team health checks, like the pre-work.
Okay.
That's linked. Yeah.
That's linked somewhere else. Yeah.
It's okay.
That's
okay.
probably not so important for this process, but we'll make sure that you get access. So I thought we'd just maybe start with going through sort of what our process and approach was. Alana, maybe do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, originally we started conversations about like, well, how can we design these questions so that afterwards we'll have useful data to analyze? And then just realized pretty quickly that we didn't know what we didn't know before we'd had all the conversations, and that we really needed to be led a lot by what we learned. And we needed to be kind of an iterative in our approach and not presuppose that all the teams were going to fit in the boxes that we expected or anything like that. So we decided to take a relatively open sort of qualitative approach and just aim for doing lots and lots of interviews and really getting a feel for the diversity in the mesh, and see if we can understand some themes and have that help guide our thinking about what to measure, how to measure, anything like that. And then so what came out was obviously this huge diversity of 68 different conversations. And then we talked a lot, and I spent a lot of time in the data and in the notes summarizing and trying to understand what these themes might be. And I would say we were able to boil it down somewhat, but again, quickly realized that we are not going to be able, or we don't want to come in and be like, okay, this is what you need to do. That it's actually more of an invitation to co-creation, or maybe some guideposts on how to facilitate that co-creation. And that these issues are complex and diverse and deeply personal, and really the solutions are going to need to come, from the mesh, but there might be things we can really do to help facilitate that or guide that or resource that. And so I feel like we intentionally didn't boil it all the way down to, okay, here's the most important problems and here's the answers. It's actually sort of halfway boiled to, cool, this is like a base that we can use to learn more. And so some of the things that came up were already being addressed by some of the interventions that are underway, whether that's the self-help, self-organization 101 or Team Foundations courses or other interventions that are already happening from your team or across the mesh. And then we tried to pick out things which might not be being addressed already by existing interventions. And so that's all the sort of systemic level type of things that we picked out in those slides. And Susan and I just had to talk about, well, what do we do with this knowledge? And realized that what we really wanted was to work in collaboration with this team and with people across the mesh to figure that out together in terms of like, here's what we're hearing. Now we need to have conversations about, well, which one of these are actually most important, or how could we begin to understand this problem more deeply or start to come up with some interventions or solutions. So I think that's where we're at, intentionally not coming to a final conclusion about things.
Mm. Thanks, Alana. Anybody, any questions for Alana before we move on?
How did you capture the data? Like, did you record the sessions or like take notes, or is it in a spreadsheet, or how did you do it? Just curious.
Yeah, kind of all of the above. So we split up the interviews among, I think there are 5 or 6 of us who know each other through Inspiral and have done this work together in the past. And we had a common notes or sort of interview template, and basically said, well, we'll kind of stick to this, but we can improvise a bit. And we all took notes in there based on that template, and we also recorded the sessions. So the summary document that I made was mostly from the notes, but we do also have the opportunity to go back and dig into some of those recorded sessions to get a bunch more rich detail if we want to.
Okay, cool. And did people feel like it was confidential?
Yeah, definitely. So that was one of the main things that when I was doing the summary, thinking like, we got to be kind of careful with this information. And I did, on the version that I think Susan shared with you, I took all the names off of things, and I did actually go in there and sort of anonymize some of the statements so that they were a little bit more general. I tried not to change people's words too much, but I did feel like it could be quite sensitive, and I am interested in your view of if the stuff that's I think the stuff in the slide deck is probably pretty generalized, and then there's the more detailed document, and I'm interested, is that something we could share, or is that still too sensitive?
Okay.
I think I just wanted to add to that. Yes, I think the expectation definitely is for confidentiality, but at the same time, I think there was a very high level of expectation that people's ideas, thoughts, reflections were going to be shared somehow. So I think there's kind of that balance there. I don't feel like anybody thought that they were just having a one-on-one and it was going to stay where it landed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And
I'm
then,
curious,
yeah.
I don't want to hog the
Oh,
conversation
go.
here.
Good. We've got time.
I'd love to pull, like, I've only been doing it for a couple months, but like the onboarding sessions that we do that are every Wednesday for 2 hours, I'd love to pull the data and cross-reference what people are asking for with what you guys were hearing. Actually, like, design some stuff that is meaningful.
Awesome. So maybe what I'll do is I'll just share the screen just so we have it up here and take us through, just more specifically the slides around what we are finding in terms of validation for the courses. And just what does the data indicate broadly? I mean, some of this is super obvious. So obviously some teams are isolated, either geographically or literally. The individuals in the team are feeling isolated. Some people just feel, we're humming, totally interconnected, feeling interdependent and really healthy. This second point came out really clearly, and I think that it applies not only at the team level, but certainly at the mesh level. So lack of protocols, and Alana, I'd love to hear what you think here, but I think this is a combination not only of having had the experience with making explicit decision-making protocols, knowing what they are, knowing which can be used when. So I think that's what that is saying to me. And then, vocabulary, we've talked about this before, how important and tricky language is.
That one for me was also about just like feeling so much empathy when I was hearing from people some of the challenges they're facing, and just having been through that myself a lot. And I think that a lot of these issues are groups that every group will struggle through, and just feeling like, oh no, I don't want you to have to like reinvent the wheel and fall in these pitfalls that people who've been through these processes several times know are there. Like, please don't labor in isolation, figuring all this stuff out again for yourself, but actually let's all talk together and work together and talk about how how these patterns come out and how we have words for some of these things and how we have tools that other people have invented, which, there is no one size fits all solution, but it's really cool to know what's in the toolbox. So that feeling came up for me quite a few times, just simply because a lot of people don't have that much lived experience in non-hierarchical organizing.
Yeah, totally. Thanks. And then on to something that I think we've all heard, like know where to go to report bad leadership. And I mean, I think, Claudia, you've got lived experience of this definitely in terms of just feeling like, oh my God, this is happening and it's horrible, but I have no idea what I can do about it or where to go to be heard. So I think that this is a key one. I love this one that, people do recognize that consensus is filled with brilliant people with skills in, certainly covering the major proportion of skills available to humans on Earth. But how do we access them? How do we know?
And it ties into a conversation that Susan and I were having this morning about how to bring up your skills so that your network or your team knows about it. And so I'm my mind is a little blown that this is mesh wide, which is.
And I think that, again, Claudia, my thinking in this is like, let's just prototype this in this team and see what we can do with it. Because I think, I certainly feel it for sure. A lot of people have ad hoc experience in some of these things, not all of these things, but not a lot of practice. That came up really strongly. So how do we move from people going to a one-day training with maybe a couple of follow-ups to more practice-based skills development? That came up really strongly.
The big one that came up for me with that was a lot of people are aware that their ad hoc processes might be working now, but they're growing quickly and it's not going to work when you're like twice as big or 10 times as big. But they don't really know what to do about that sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Did you find a split between also the size of teams? Because like you said, my sense is that a lot of the smaller teams are making it work just because you can get 5 people to mostly work their way through things.
Yeah, definitely.
We didn't specifically slice the data that way, but we can do that because we asked those questions. So that might be something interesting.
I definitely heard from one story that I heard a couple of times was we went through a crisis when we scaled, and now we're at the other side of it, and we've got some better practices now or some better governance or decision-making protocols, but it was tough to go through, and I'm seeing other teams heading for that crisis. Like, can we do a thing where you don't have to go through the crisis? So that's something I heard from people who are at the other side of it. And I think there are probably also some teams that are scaled up and still haven't had maybe some of these conversations and are running on maybe a really strong or charismatic leader kind of deciding a lot of things, or people not knowing how to actually address the power dynamics that are at play and things like that. And there are teams who have successfully figured out how to do some things at scale as well that have some best practices that maybe could be shared across the mesh.
I think an example of this for me feels like what's the Academy experience. So Academy had the experience of ejecting the human that was making everybody's life miserable. But then what's come in and been what it's been replaced by for some of the humans in that group is equally as confusing and feeling ad hoc and like, oh, okay, so some people stepped into the power vacuum, but I kind of don't understand what's going on or how that happened. So things like that. And I think that also then follows on into the next bullet point, which is this whole implicit hierarchy, sometimes explicit, but just because it's for the lack of sort of the explicit processes. And then finally, it's no surprise to any of us, there's significant disparity between the old guard, the first 100, 200 that were hired just because they were amazing people. And the assumption was that their skills would be needed. They'd figure out a way to add value and find where their energy is bringing them and where they're most useful. And the new arrivals, like the last 800, who have been recruited in a much more traditional way with written job descriptions and interview process. Any questions on the general data before we move on? Okay. So as Alana was saying, one of the things that we were looking for, because we started this probably within our first couple of weeks of arriving into the mesh, was, okay, we've got some assumptions around what these interventions will do and what their potential impact is, but let's really validate if what we've designed is what the mesh actually needs. So we just wanted to follow through. But for some reason for me, it didn't feel so important the more that we went through it and the more that we were validating the experience of the people that were going through the pilots. But we still thought it was a good exercise to go through and kind of pull out things that we thought were covered in the courses that we're running. So, what are the healthy elements? So one of the questions that we asked is, if you were to assess the health of another team in the mesh, what would you be looking for? And so these comments are reflections of that question. And so, yeah, just kind of pull them out and pop them in to see how these are amplified or further practices built around in SO 101. So, obvious things like feedback and honesty and openness, people taking the initiative, self-awareness, team mindset, all of those things are reflected in SO 101. And then we had another question, which was, what are some of the dysfunctional or less healthy elements or behaviors we're seeing in the mesh? So equally, then the dysfunctions that came up that we believe SO 101 addresses are things like silos and lack of generosity and defensiveness and inability to ship, I think, is a big one. As Mary will know from SO 101, that's a really big priority in that particular intervention. And free riders coasting on the work of others. And then the last question we asked, in amongst a whole bunch of other stuff around specific questions about the individual's team. And then Alana went through and kind of grouped these into, I don't know how many we ended up with, maybe 10 or 12 different themes. Culture, L&D, self-organizing. Can you remember some of the other ones, Alana? Governance.
There were heaps like communications and meetings and comms and I don't remember them all. They're all in the document, but they'll come through, I think, in the other slides.
Mm-hmm. And so then pulled out the either the questions or the comments or what people were looking for. So obviously things like, how can we create trust faster? How can we make our work visible? How can we support our personal development? How do we walk the walk ourselves? So that was SO 101. We did a similar exercise with team foundations. Just looking here about some of the stuff that's maybe a little bit different is Team Foundations focuses on a little bit more on documentation and retrospectives, clear performance metrics. So yeah, that's kind of maybe the main difference there. And again, a lot of the dysfunctions addressed are similar, but changes are a little bit different. So focusing mainly here on governance, so early detection of problems, which we are looking at with the health checks, helping people to actually create for themselves what strategic interventions they want to do, and again, creating trust faster, supporting development, and all the other things. And then Alana, maybe hand over to you for the next few slides around what we found felt more like systemic or mesh-wide noticings. I think that very much so far we've been focused on like team-based interventions, even individual-based intervention. But what is the data telling us in terms of what we could or should be thinking about at a mesh-wide level?
Yeah, sure. So we literally went through and after taking out some of the things that are definitely covered by the two courses on the individual and the group level, I looked at the stuff that wasn't and tried to understand the themes that were emerging or what some of the key messages were. And yeah, I didn't find any way to boil this down very far. There's like 5 slides of this. And this is why I'm like, well, I, as pretty much an outsider, am not the one to say which of these issues is the most important or what the solutions might be. But definitely imagined much more of like maybe facilitating further conversations about that so that people in the mesh could help figure that out or help develop solutions for themselves. So that was the mindset that I had when I was trying to describe the different issues that were coming out. And so on here you can see I put them into categories and tried to explain what they are. And then the italic quotes, those are the actual quotes from people in their own words that relate to these issues. So I can just go over them very, very briefly. Yeah, hiring and onboarding was one that came up quite a bit. I think onboarding, so the reason why, like, onboarding is obviously an issue at the team level as well, but people are bringing this up in terms of a cross-mesh issue, in terms of how do people get onboarded into the mesh in general? How do we address differences between what people are told in team onboarding versus what it looks like, how things work across the mesh? How do we address things that are perhaps broader cultural things, like this quote about emphasizing self-starters is a bullshit excuse for not having good onboarding, or like these kinds of questions I think go beyond the level of a single team. And I think the answers will come from, a diversity of perspectives being in the conversation. Firing, offboarding, so this was a massive one. And things like, oh, well, Joe just comes down and fires people after 100 people have complained. Like, that's not an issue. I don't think that's going to be solved within one team. It's something that you kind of have to talk about how the mesh works overall. And there was a lot of, I would say, emotion or fear or anxiety or trauma associated with this one. So that comes through, I think, of it in people's words there. And maybe some like resentment, or what do you do with resentment if people aren't getting fired that you think should be? And I empathize with that a lot, because I personally learned over the years I don't really want to work somewhere where no one gets fired. Anyway, diversity, like gender diversity, big theme. This came up in the SO 101 session that I joined into with Mary as well. That is a huge issue. I don't know exactly where to start. It's a conversation that I think we need to have. Is it a boys' club? Is it a fiefdom? What does really creating a culture of diversity mean? It's like, as someone says here, it's one thing to bring in female engineers, but it's useless if the culture doesn't support them. And they're pointing out some very deep questions. Okay, can we go to the next slide? Leadership. This is like a huge passion of mine. So of course I wanted to make this box really big, but I really tried to boil it down. But basically, like, I think of leadership occurring at different levels. There's like self-leadership, like how do you engage effectively in a team? There's leading others. And then there's this level of sort of how do we lead leaders? How do we grow leaders? How do we grow our overall capacity for leadership in our culture or in the mesh? And I think some of these questions really speak to that. Also, when you intersect issues of leadership with issues of self-management and non-hierarchy, I think you get a pretty unique set of issues and skills and topics that need to be discussed. It's going to look different than, the leadership book you pull out of the business section at your standard bookstore, because like things like instead of hiring a middle manager, we need to look at actually improving our capacity for self-management. What does distributing leadership really look like? If it's not building a hierarchy, we need to talk about what actually it is. How do people navigate leadership in a context of flatness? I personally believe that leadership is so extremely important when you don't have a hierarchy. It just can come from lots of different people in lots of different ways. So I think some of these quotes speak to that. And also, what do you do when leadership is just really bad? Like, you need some sort of meta level to talk about this beyond the level of teams. Like the person leading my previous team was not an okay human being. They were abusive. Like, if there's nowhere to take that, that's a serious, serious problem. And it by definition won't be addressed by that leader on their team. Governance as well, I think is pretty related. That's sort of why I put them next to each other. Like, how do we think about, how do you make a decision-making policy without a decision-making policy? There's that bootstrapping problem that several people brought up. What is the role of like a constitution in an environment where people have autonomy? Yeah. Oh, I thought this was an excellent point. Governance is critical for self-selection. People need to be able to see how groups are working to decide if they want to join. So it's like the intersection of maybe hiring and governance. If you don't have any explicit processes, it's really hard to see from the beginning how things work. Yeah, this one, I've been going around asking people, how do you keep yourself accountable to your work? Most people react by saying, I don't want to have this conversation. And so this came from somebody who was obviously very experienced in their career and thinks quite deeply about these, and was just basically going like, what is going on at this place? So yeah, these issues I think are, again, quite deep and complex questions. Autonomy gone mad. So this is basically like, you're not the boss of me. You can't, autonomy means you can't tell me what to do, and I never have to do anything I don't want to. Somebody literally said to me, my contract says I don't have to do anything I don't want to. So I was just kind of like, okay, that's a little bit of like a shallow / unconstructive vision of autonomy here. But then again, like, yeah.
Sorry, I just want to say, and then the opposite here, I'm in Israel, and I was talking to some of the people in the mesh here, and their contracts actually say the exact opposite. You must do exactly what your manager tells you. So yeah, super interesting.
Yeah, and I think people do bring baggage with them from experiences with hierarchy where they had really bad time with people telling them what to do, and so they think the opposite of that is going to be good, but the actual conversation is much more nuanced. Like I personally have worked in a lot of what I would call anarchist businesses, and people think anarchy is about doing whatever you want, but anarchy is actually about having lots of meetings. It's not as like fun and cool as you might think. It means nothing's pre-decided, so we actually have to talk to each other and figure out all this stuff together. So I think that conversation is an interesting one. Free rider problem, this came up in some of the earlier slides as well, but I think on the mesh level it is relevant as well. People can sort of quote unquote hide in the mesh not doing anything. What does oversight look like as the mesh gets so big? And as that scales up, we can't rely on just sort of always noticing what everybody's up to. And what happens, when people actually miss targets or don't contribute in the way that they're meant to. So sort of intersects possibly with offboarding. Strategic alignment. So this was at the level of the mesh. So obviously every team is going to be thinking about strategy, but what does it mean to actually align strategies across the mesh so that we're not working on cross purposes? And also when people are thinking on this level and they see important strategic things bubbling up cross mesh, like who do they bring that up to? What do they do with that insight? And also I think people who think quite deeply and constructively about strategy know that you can't come up with your own strategy in a vacuum. It kind of has to relate to the bigger picture to actually be strategic. I thought this quote was interesting. What are we trying to do? I don't know what Joe is trying to do. I don't know what anybody else is trying to do. So just like, yeah, when people are feeling lost on that level, where are they meant to go with that? Yep. Oh yeah, next one. Sorry, I realized that I'm basically taking like some of the hugest, deepest, most complex issues and just piling them on top of each other, but I think it's a starting place. Scaling, this is kind of like what I mentioned before about things that are working at a small scale might not work as teams get bigger, and people know this, but they're not really sure what to do about it. We're growing faster than infrastructure can support. Yeah, how are we going to work together when there are 2,000 people? And I was talking to somebody who was obviously very passionate about their culture, and very passionate about scaling, and their main focus was like growing this team as fast as possible. And he's like, I have no idea how to bottle our culture and scale it, and all I can do is just be here every single day answering for questions and helping people. And like I really like admired their commitment and hoped that they weren't going to get themselves into a terrible burnout situation, which seems possible. HR, like, I don't know what's up with HR. You all know way more about that than me, but people are mad. People are very upset about some shortfalls of HR. Maybe that's already been addressed, and it just hasn't, come back online or whatever. But yeah, it's a bottleneck for fast-growing teams on kind of a practical level, but just people can't talk to HR effectively. People trying to get their questions about benefits or health plans answered, or somebody said they were trying to bring up a serious HR concerns and that they've tried 3 times to get a meeting and they just stopped responding, and they feel like they're getting punished for trying to be a good citizen. And that scared me a lot, like as somebody like wading into a new community and trying to figure out what's going on, like that, yeah, that sent up some red flags. On the other hand, people had some good things to say about other mesh services like legal and IT being pretty responsive and then being pretty happy. And there's just nowhere to go with that level of feedback about a whole mesh service. Finances, I think this is about the finances of the mesh overall. So people have questions about RAC, and also about the sort of underlying values. Like, is it just about profit maximization, or are we actually about something else too? Because somebody shared their experience about trying to talk to RAC about things other than return on investment, like social impact and stuff like that, and it just sort of going nowhere. I think that's a cultural question or a values question. Meetings, comms, and tools, lots and lots and lots of little detailed things in this category, but things like people want to know why TMNT isn't used as much or how it could be more useful. I was talking to somebody who was obviously similar to me, like a documentation geek who, like, if there's something like TMNT, is going to live in it. And he's like, why am I the only one who cares about this? And so I was empathizing with him and also thinking, like, I don't know why people, it's the same question people have about any like wikis or knowledge sharing thing. And it's a hard question. Information overload is not effective transparency. So on the mesh level, how do we actually curate what information do people need to effectively engage? Tool overload, like people being autonomous and going off and like, I don't like this chat program, I'm going to use that chat program. You have to come over there to talk to me if you want to talk to me, and that just not being very functional. And some like really practical stuff in here, like better ways to find global documentation. Meetings was a big theme, like people who work across multiple teams getting meetings scheduled in totally impossible ways, and other people being like, I just don't go to meetings, sorry. And me just thinking like, wow, okay, there's got to be something going on there. Calendars, that sort of thing. Working across and on the mesh, so people are, just really briefly on that last one, there are many people who I think are quite passionate about the mesh as a whole and the culture as a whole, but don't exactly know where to go with that energy, and they have maybe lots of good ideas. So I was thinking like these are the kind of people who might put their hands up to be on a working group to take on some of these questions if they have any capacity. Lots of ideas kind of bubbling up there. Next one, we're coming towards the end now. Regional issues. Susan had a good conversation with some people, I think working in the Asia region, who felt like a bit left out of things, or like their issues weren't necessarily getting addressed. So ideas for different kinds of representation there. Overall cultural and identity. This was a little bit of a catch-all, but kind of like the big sort of who are we as consensus questions. And so what does non-hierarchy really mean to us? What does it mean to be like citizens of this place? How do we change cultural issues like, I think we don't talk about failure enough right across the mesh? How do we shift something like that? I think we don't emphasize delivery enough. There's not enough people here who've shipped products that people actually use. How do we talk about that? What are people's identity in the mesh as part of consensus, not just as part of their team or their project or their spoke? Like, how does that actually work? I think this might be the last one. Is there another page? Yeah, cool. So this leading into, basically like all of those colored boxes I just said, there were no answers in there. There were only questions, and me basically saying we need to work together, I think, across the mesh to find any of those answers. So when we were talking about this slide deck, we were thinking, well, what are the calls to action? And I think this deck is not ready to send out to anyone, but thinking we do want to circle back to the people that we interviewed and the wider mesh. And maybe it's about, hey, do you resonate with these things that we're talking about related to the courses? You probably want to sign up. This is how you do it. Or, hey, are you interested in some of these complex systemic issues? And then create some sort of invitation to, I'm not sure what it is. I'm not sure if it's a working group or a conference or a team, or I'm not sure, but I think there's a call to action there for the people who do think on that level.
That was a lot. What's coming up for people?
It tracks with all the stuff that I've heard for the past year. And it's really good to have it all in one place. I think the quotes are also really helpful that they make it, they give a flavor of the nuance of it. So yeah, it all makes sense. Yeah, no real surprises. I think some issues that I hadn't fully thought through, but yeah.
And I've only been here 3 months. Yeah, I think it's pretty like irresponsible not to get to a better onboarding program together quickly, and then for teams to consider how they're integrating people into their teams.
For me, it's just like, wow, like we're only growing and these matters are still, these issues have existed and are existing, and it feels overwhelming. Like, how do we address this and fix it? And I know that sounds like, oh yeah, there's just 3 things we have to do and it'll all go away. I know that's naive, but to Will's point, there's no surprise. It's been going on for a long time, and it's like, okay, where do we start?
I think for me that it didn't start coming up for me until just now, going over it again, thinking about, my expectation or bias is that the people that put their hands up to have these conversations either are just the typical people who feel that responsibility to share what they're seeing, or people that are in so much pain, they're just like desperate to have their voices heard, or those that are like super interested in, I want to be part of building this thing. Please give me a way to be part of a cross-mesh working group, or even cross-mesh circle, so that we can help to do this. What scares me in this is all of those voices that we didn't hear that might be suffering significantly. And yeah, I don't know why that's just like suddenly came really clear to me in this discussion.
Well,
I think that's a really important point, like just to keep in mind that this data came from the people who put their hands up to be interviewed. Mm-hmm. So we aren't hearing from a lot of people. We are hearing from people, who are predisposed to think about this stuff or who have an axe to grind. We're not hearing from people who are like so busy or so disengaged that they wouldn't put their hands up. And I think the same thing goes for if we put the call out for a working group. I'm not sure just going with the people who raise their hands is always the best way to get the people you need in the room. Although that's really like paradoxical in a scenario where everybody's supposed to choose all their own work, but that's something we should just keep in mind. Sorry, Will, I think you were trying to break in.
Yeah, and my question is similar to what Mary was saying, that it's or wrote in the chat, which was there's also a selection bias of the folks who also, like you said, we're feeling kind of like that there's a problem or something like that. And my curiosity is, were we talking to folks that are functional, doing great, but also are kind of like, mesh is crazy, we're doing fine, I'm trying to write a code, like I'm trying to get my app out. So it's, that'd be the thing that I would think is important to kind of name within this, is like that, to also just know that there's a natural selection bias in this. And so, yeah.
Sorry, I know, like, for example, that Joshua had a conversation with, I can't remember his name, from Infura, and JB was just like, oh, no, they're great. They don't need anything. They're fine. Yep. It's all good. There were over 40 teams represented, so I think that we did get a good cross section. But yes, so there were, even if there were 40 teams, there's still 10 or 15 that were missing.
I definitely heard the like, we're doing great, mesh is crazy from some people. And also there's a question in here from Mary, like, what about the positives? I think that's really good to keep in mind. This slide deck is not my part of the slide deck with the colored boxes were not about the positives, and they definitely came through. So if you click through and read the full summary document, which is like 18 pages long, and especially the quotes, and also there was the whole long list of bullet points about healthy teams and what that looks like, and a lot of the quotes, there were amazing quotes in there, like we have the opportunity to like change amazing things, or this what Joe's doing is incredible, or I love my teammates, and like that stuff was totally all there. But this slide deck was specifically picking out systemic problems, so I think it's misleading.
Okay.
I just wanted to say that triggered something for me. for the first time, I feel really bad for the people team. I feel like their leader was taken, or sorry, the leader left, and they were sort of left with this mess. I feel like they have such a horrible rap, and I've been someone who has felt like that too. But when I talk to some of them, like, they want to help. They want to do what a functioning people team should do. But I feel really like my heart goes out to them. They're not the enemy. And I'm not saying people think they are, but I'm talking more about me, I would say. Like, I think I was very resentful to them for some time. And just seeing that particular slide that was there was like, like, I want to advocate for them in whatever way. And, there's a lot happening with them too, which, that's like not, there are bigger things happening to rectify the situation. But that was just such a trigger for me. Like, these guys are part of the mesh too, and they're suffering too, and they're trying to do the best they can with what they have. And I wish that was more known.
It's interesting to think about how scale really creates the possibility of, like, I don't want to say dehumanization, but sort of like, I think at this scale, there are some people who have no connection as humans to anybody on that team, for example, and all they really see is the sort of transactional relationship of, I need a thing you're not giving me, therefore you suck. And people, there was a quote in that about how I'm sorry, I'm going to use all the wrong terminology, but basically, like, we're losing inter-spoke trust as we scale because things are just getting so big. And I think that's a really interesting thing to keep in mind with the set of scaling issues as well.
Yeah, I think just in terms of kind of thinking about this data moving forward a little bit, the thing on naming the positives and naming the teams that are working is going to be important, because when you named Infura, it's like, I actually asked folks, it's like, name me the folks that are really working. Because I noticed that when I was doing some of the OD and global ops work back in July, I was realizing, I'm targeting everything towards fixing dysfunctionality. And we really need to take a look at, well, what services are we offering for folks who are functional and want to become good, and folks who are good and want to become great. That we need to focus on that as well. And I think it's a really important thing to offer in terms of the vision of this, because if it's only looked at, we're fixing what's messed up. I think kind of just in terms of the framing that creates, that's problematic. But B, I think that also really misses something important, which is that we need to get the high-level teams functioning and kind of just like humming, because for the health of the company, them doing well is going to be really important. And then they also model to everyone else what a functional team looks like. So I think naming that and pointing out, we don't have to point, you're anonymizing it, but so that's the first thing, is thinking about like kind of the full picture of that. The second thing is, I just have a very specific thing. I do know that Joe does not receive information well when it's nothing but critique. He just doesn't like it, just on an emotional level. I've seen him do that a couple like times when another team that I was working with consulting kind of came in and they were all like, this is how your communications are fucked up and we're going to be brilliant and fix it. And Joe was just kind of like, no thanks, and so just to be aware that it's important that, and part of this is, I think, in fairness, that Joe sees that there's a lot of fundamentally, excellent things happening in the mesh. And then also it's, I think that he feels like it's not a complete perspective. And I want to name between all of us, I think Joe has an overly rosy view of how things are going. And I think Joe doesn't necessarily always pay attention. It takes him a fair amount of time to handle problems. Like, I don't know why people wasn't fixed in January, because I was told that everyone was clear that it was broken in November, So but just to be real about it, like knowing that there's a kind of some code classes, but also like if it hits him too hard, he kind of becomes dismissive of things.
So a couple of things in that, Will, I'm just going to challenge this a little bit, is I still feel what came up for me when you were saying that is like this still perpetuating, whether it's true or not, the kind of view that unless Joe is across this and somehow blesses it, it's not going to happen. I think that at some stage, and maybe this isn't the point, but at some point, some groups of people are just going to have to proceed until apprehended with going and fixing things or doing things. Because if we're still expecting that everything needs to be acknowledged and blessed by Joe, we're not actually shifting his power. Maybe that's an impossible ask, but I just wanted to name it.
That's assuming.
Yeah, I totally hear that, but that's not what I'm saying at all. Because I think the work that we're doing is right on, and I think that everybody who's down in the mesh is really clear on what's going wrong. I'm just saying, like, in terms of being aware how it can be received, in terms, it's not that it needs blessing, but don't pick a fight that we don't need, and don't create a problem that we don't have to have. That's the extent of what I'm saying.
Totally. So I guess then that leads to the next question is, how do we want to share this? Do we want to share this? What could be the next steps around A, sharing this, and B, really, I'm super keen to explore the idea of a working group that wants to and just needs to, for their own whatever, to be part of looking at this systemic level stuff. DNA is part of that, but there's also people in the mesh that I feel, just like you've done with compensation stuff, to get a real cross-mesh ownership of this.
This discussion has also reminded me that there are other things from this work that aren't coming through in these slides. So these slides covering just what was the courses and these systemic issues. There's a whole section in that 18-page summary report, which is just best practices that teams have that are working really well that could be shared. And like we could do like a whole intervention just on that and probably make a massive positive impact across the mesh. So I think it's like there's way more here than we would probably have the capacity to ever do. And it's really up to us, as Susan is saying, to sort of which bits are we going to carve out, or what interventions or what modes could actually be effective. And if focusing on the positive and getting more people trying out stuff that teams are working is it, then that could be awesome too.
Yeah, I'd say so. It's really good to hear like how much positive is out there, and I think that's a really important thing to do, because I'm also cautious of the little bit kind of like we're fucked kind of thing coming out of all of this, because I think that there's a lot of depression and a lot of things that have gone wrong, and I think so. I could imagine like if folks saw this report, I think there'd be this kind of slumping down of we're never going to fix this monster, and maybe we aren't, but like I don't think we have to like throw those rocks into the camel's back, and so it's. So I think naming the positives is really important, because indicating that it can be done well, and then also getting those folks to like. One of my interests is also like I would guess that one of the common themes is every one of those teams that's doing it well has said because we dedicated time to making it go well, right? So if that's the key message, that you don't just get to like heads down and like code, you've got to think about your processes. That's the tax of doing self-organizing, right? Is civic participation. And so if we were able to get folks to think about that in terms of their planning, I think that could be a big piece. The thing I want to say about working group is just to name kind of like learning something from, there's a lot of conversation we can have around a lot of lessons learned around doing the compensation working group. The other thing that I do want to say is that I don't know if you would know this, but from the past history, but in the first 2 years of existence, an enormous amount of energy was put in by a lot of folks to have a lot of working groups to analyze values and cultures and systems and processes. There's literally like 20 documents that I read through, just going through all of these half-formed, three-quarter done processes to try to pull things together and kind of create all the things that we ought to be having, but we don't. So I want to say that the OGs might look at that and kind of be a little bit like this again, because one phrase that I was actually told when I was all excited to form all these working groups is I was told that the OGs all had working group fatigue, which is a phrase I'd never heard, but instantly made sense. So I think it's right, but I think the question is really execution and what does it take to fully do this. And the thing about the compensation is compensation wouldn't work if we didn't have 4 people at the center of it who are doing nothing pretty much but working on compensation. Like we have to structure this, and I think it can't be like a side project. I think it needs to be staffed, and there needs to be budgets, and there needs to be support.
Yeah, that's why the onboarding thing is still broken, because
Right.
people won't dedicate 100% of their time to it. No one owns it, right?
Right.
So it's like, we do this quick fix of this 2-hour call, but it's like not enough. And you should hear these people crying for help. Like, it breaks my heart. Today, I swear, at 1:00, like, after I was done, I just wanted to cry. I was really happy that I could touch, like, we had the moment together. But then I just was like, oh my God, God bless you. Like, good luck. I don't know.
Good luck. Right. Yeah.
I think it would be a mistake to feel like this report means we have to take on all of these issues. And it would also be a mistake to think we have to like propagate all of the positive practices or anything. I think the only way forward is to maybe do some thinking or some talking about prioritization, or which of these do we actually think we can make a difference on, or what do we have the capacity for, and then actually only take on what can be really well resourced and taken through to 100%, because as you say, it's really easy to take something halfway there and it ends up being some report no one ever reads, or just people being fatigued. I think it would be a mistake maybe to just send out this kind of thing with no context like that. We probably need to do some more thinking and some more targeting, because the attention economy is real and we should be like thinking about what we actually want to spend it on.
I think that we do have a responsibility to the people that took their time to have these conversations, to update them on what we're doing. So I feel like there's a couple of layers to this.
Yeah, I was wondering, what are their expectations? Like, how did you frame it? What do they expect?
I don't think that we were anything other than we'll share what we find. I think that's the basic expectation.
Okay.
I mean, I think one of the things for me is that this comes down to what, not exclusive to DNA, but what is DNA's strategy and plan? Because there's lots of talk of vision, which is fine, but I'm like, what's the strategy? What's the plan? What's the budget? What's the staff? And kind of like getting in there and saying like, okay, so which interventions are we going to make that are going to leverage things that have a mesh-wide impact? What are the teams specifically that we want to work with in order to be able to kind of move them forward in this? What are the systems that we could put in place that that start to get us where we need to go within the next 6 months? I think we have we have a lot of those together, and I think like this data will give us a good footing on that. But yeah, I mean, I think
I don't think it's only DNA though. I think it's also the people team.
A lot of it's going to be people team, no question. But also, I'm going to say, by the way, people team is about to just get their workload crushed by compensation. Because basically, what's going to happen is we're going to take compensation and go, here you go, right? So,
like bringing them into this conversation, because now we have new people that, in talking about conversation, Will told us, which has made sense, where Zahava was like, "Why are you guys doing this? Why aren't we doing this?" Right? And it's like there's no background information that she's aware of because she just started. So I think it's like, I don't think it's just DNA. But to Will's point, you're right. Like, what is the goal of the people team? Like what are they going to be doing? And compensation is no small feat. So does that mean we can't have them help us with anything at all, like even onboarding, or like what is their role in all this? And are they going to staff or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, we're close on time. I mean, I think there are ways that we can divide up who's doing what. I think that standard functions like onboarding, getting some kind of coherent performance evaluation process there, like knowing that performance evaluation can be awful, but also like knowing that if we can create a kind of a peer-to-peer evaluation system where there begins to be accountability, feedback, retros, things that are built in so that we can have the sort of things that start to develop that, like that could be if people team just pulled off onboarding, effective compensation, and some form of coherent performance evaluation, which by the way then also allows for people to be offboarded. One of my beliefs, and the reason that we're not offboarding anybody, is that everybody's scared shitless of firing somebody because you don't even have a track record to justify it if they wanted to turn around and sue. So there's like some basic HR functions that I think if they just spent the next 6 months to a year getting those, it would help a lot. And then I think DNA and my thought is that just like compensation, DNA doesn't have to own this, but DNA can be one of the people that says, we will staff this, we will create a budget, we will create a plan, and we will engage the mesh in order to make these things work. You know, and we're supposed to be meeting with Zahava tomorrow on performance evaluation. And my number one piece of advice is you need to do a process similar to what we did with compensation. It can be even more decentralized, but that, you know, like integrate the mesh in this and get people involved in the process.
And well, just to clarify, she's the U.S. person, right? They haven't hired a like main people team lead.
As I understand it, but I think for now she's sort of functioning as the people lead because they don't have anybody. Like they just needed somebody. But I think the eventual idea is that she's the U.S. lead, but who knows? Yeah. Cool.
So we're at time. I feel like I didn't get clarity on next steps.
I would, so if I was to say, I would say if does it make sense to create, even if it's not as extensive, but to create something that also balances this deck that says, here are the positives, here's what's working, you know? And I think that it'd be really good to present both of those. And
I'm wondering about, like, yeah, that's a clear action that I heard, which is include the positives and anything that we report back. I'm wondering, I mean, I'm always defaulting to like more transparency, just, you know, be open with everybody, but I don't want to like create any kind of dramas either. But I could add to this slide deck a lot of the positive best practices to share, like positive quotes, that sort of thing. And we could send it back to the people that we interviewed to close the loop with them. Yeah. And I'm thinking leave in the call to action, which is like, if you're resonating with these things that the course has covered, you can sign up for them. Yep. And maybe don't put in a call to action and just be really upfront and say, we're still processing and thinking about what to do about all the rest of this stuff. You know, if you're interested, of course, you know, get in touch with us, but we'll be coming back at some other time to let you know, because we're still thinking about it. It's just something honest like that. That's what jumps to my mind.
Yeah, I like that, because I think, you know, honestly, I think it is a call to action to say, like, you know, okay, I'm going to be really snarky because it's late. Here's an idea. How about if everybody actually studies self-organizing, and then we can talk about how to implement self-organizing as a solution? Like, what if we actually started from a base of knowledge rather than everybody's thinking whatever they think self-organizing means? Because that's my
snarky. That's not what I was thinking.
That's my constant madness around this. I'm like, I'm checking in with these folks who like are doing self-organizing and they've never even cracked a book.
Yeah,
so, We'll talk to somebody who knows how to do it.
Yeah.
It's like,
yeah.
You know, and I think I put myself in the category of like having some experiences, but not others in teal. So it's like, I think if we like really just, if the folks who are dedicated about this said, all right, let's dedicate in, right? Like here's a plan for 2018, get informed, start building systems, get the processes in place. That's going to, you know, so we're at least kind of coming from a baseline of knowledge. Yeah.
Yeah, and also maybe hire people with experience of non-hierarchical self-organizing.
Hey.
Sorry.
Nah.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Claudia. I have no idea what time it is there. I know it's incredibly late. But yeah, I really appreciate the three of you taking the time to help us make further sense of this. And yeah, Alana, you and I have a conversation about creating a more balanced deck and getting that delivered within the next week or so.
Just a quick question before because what's in my mind is like, yeah, do you think there's a reason, after we balance it out with the positive stuff, do you think it's okay to share back this deck that has a lot of problems in it as well with, okay, great.
100%. No, this
share
should
with participants or the mesh?
I was thinking the 68 participants as a starting place, but I'm assuming some of them might share it on, or it might, you know, get out there somehow.
It'll get out there. Yeah, I think it'll really get out there. I think absolutely, because by the way, this deck isn't going to shock anyone. I think who's been here for a little while, and you know, the caution that I said around Joe was just like, let's not like. I just don't want him to dismiss it, because I think he could, and I think putting in the positive, I mean, I think it'll just. Yes.
Actually, I have to say, Samantha was saying yesterday that Joe was behind her a couple of days ago when she was looking at it, and he said, what does it say about this? What does it say about that? So he knows of its existence,
good.
Which is good.
He'll be, I think, here's the thing. I actually think, and you know, and it's not to always go back to King Joe, but it never hurts to have him like say stuff, because there's a lot of folks who just are used to the monarchist king and like they pay attention to what Joe pays attention to. So last thing I want to say is just like really thank you for doing this level of work, the diligence of this, and like, you know, having so many teams go in there, doing the qualitative research that we've needed. This has all been anecdotes, and this actually starts to pull it together. The fact that you can say, we did this on multiple, you know, we did this internationally, we did this with 40 teams, you know, we asked these questions, here's the positive, here's the negative. I think that will kind of like, we can get past this kind of anecdotal thing that I've seen consensus be stuck in for a long time. So I think this is an incredibly valuable piece of work, and just really appreciate how also just the quality and the brevity of like, we covered so many ideas, but in a way that feels very digestible in this deck. So both the research and also the presentation of it is just excellent. So thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, team. See you soon. Bye.
Okay.
I'll share the recording in the DNA channel.
Okay, thank you. Thank you both.
Bye.
Susan, can we debrief here or should we start a new?